Just 2 short years from now will mark the 30th anniversary of the Resident Evil franchise. And you all know what we can expect from that if the evil residents of Capcom capitalize on this occasion, right? Another Resident Evil remake? Maybe? Why not go back, again, to where it all started in the franchise with a revisit to the Spencer Mansion, but this time be a remake of the very first Resident Evil remake. I know, probably the longtime fans are already blasting the comments section saying that Resident Evil doesn't need to be remade yet again and will call us all casuals, even though many of us grew up with and played the OG in the remake. And while I agree that it doesn't need it, I do argue that it would be in Capcom's best interest to see another remake of this classic game happen. Let's explore the history of the Resident Evil remake and dive into the many reasons why another remake of the game that started it all is the perfect way to usher in the 30th year of Resident Evil. As always, voice your thoughts in the comments as to why you would or wouldn't like to see the original Resident Evil get another remake. No spoilers going forward, since I know some viewers have not experienced Resident Evil 1 or its remake, so don't worry about the big revelations or anything like that here.
Jill, come on! Chris, this way. Make for that mansion!
Let's jump back in time to when it all started. Resident Evil released on the PlayStation back in 1996 and was a resounding success and is considered the landmark game that started the survival horror genre. At the time, it was a harrowing adventure that put players through narrow, claustrophobic, and haunting corridors through the twisted passageways of an unnerving mansion with the task of uncovering its numerous mysteries while also trying to make it out alive. Here, we got introduced to now iconic characters in the Resident Evil franchise, like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker, to name but a few. 6 years later, in 2002, Capcom released Resident Evil on the Nintendo GameCube, a remake of the original PlayStation release, which again achieved critical acclaim and managed to sell over 1.5 million units. The GameCube remake enhanced the graphics beautifully by making the environments feel alive, greatly enhanced the character models, redid the voiceovers for the cast, added new areas to explore, and added one of the most frightening subplots in all of Resident Evil with the addition of Lisa Trevor. Better yet, this remake allowed players to swap control styles by giving players the option to forego the traditional tank controls for an experience that made navigation a bit more intuitive, introduced defensive weapons for players to get out of dangerous grapples, added new enemies, expanded the story, and so much more. This remake is seriously incredible, and I highly encourage fans of the series to play it, as this is hands down the best way to experience the first game as of now. Shinji Mikami, the director of the remake and the creator of the Resident Evil franchise, expressed that this remake of the original game represented the game's original vision, as the original PlayStation release prevented the studio from truly making the original as they had originally hoped, due to the technical limitations of the technology back in '96. With the greatly enhanced power of the GameCube, Mikami and his team set out to truly deliver on the vision of the original game in this remake. Before the release of Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evils 1 through 3 had already been released, colloquially known as the original trilogy of Resident Evil games. And as this was truly the next iteration of Resident Evil, made primarily for the next generation at the time, Capcom went all out to make the remake bigger and better than any Resident Evil game that came before it. The goal in developing Resident Evil for the GameCube was to achieve motion picture quality visuals and create even more suspense and fear than the original, said Todd Thorson, the director of marketing for Capcom ahead of the game's release in early 2002. The game has been completely redone. So many details have been added to this version that fans new and old will be awestruck. As we know, the game has been incredibly well received, won numerous awards, and the consensus was that this was the best Resident Evil game that had ever debuted at the time of its release. But its release was over 20 years ago. For as great of a game as it still is today, it still doesn't dismiss the fact that this game is over 20 years old and is a prime candidate to get yet another remake. While I personally don't take issue with the fixed camera angles and combat systems of this classic remake, this isn't about how I feel about it, but rather how the community feels about it going forward. While Resident Evil Code Veronica is the clear winner when it comes to what fans want in the next Resident Evil remake, we can't dismiss that there is also a sizable base of both older Resident Evil fans and newer ones alike that would be more than happy to revisit the Spencer Mansion where we first got introduced to these now iconic characters and storylines. Just remember, the vast majority of players started flocking to Resident Evil after the success of Resident Evil 4, and with every game since Resident Evil 4 debuted in 2005, these Resident Evil games, both mainline and remakes alike, have been pushing north of 10 million units sold and still climbing. Another remake of Resident Evil 1 would give both older fans and especially new fans of the series an incentive to experience the first game, seeing as a number of Resident Evil fans are uninterested and unwilling to play a game that sports fixed camera angles, old school combat mechanics, and some admittedly dated voice acting. Again, I freaking love Resident Evil 1 Remake, and I personally think that the RE1 Remake is, on paper, the best remake we've seen Capcom make of the Resident Evil franchise, and this comes from a fan who especially loves the more contemporary Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 remakes. I've been making Resident Evil content for over a year now, and I am overwhelmingly being told in the comments that both newer and older fans of Resident Evil alike would love to experience Resident Evil Remake in the RE engine with an over-the-shoulder perspective, and I mean, I can't blame them for wanting that. With the 30th anniversary rapidly approaching, a ground-up remake of the Resident Evil 1 remake just makes perfect sense. Add an excellent VR mode like the previous few Resident Evil games have sported, and you have an instant winner. We've discussed this at length in another video surrounding the next remakes that are likely to happen in the series, and we have to discuss story continuity when it comes to what happens after Resident Evil 4 Remake. The last 3 games to get remade, Resident Evils 2, 3, and 4, suggest that 5 is next in line when following that chronology. But I argue that while Resident Evil 5 definitely makes sense to get remade, games like Resident Evil 1, 0, and Code Veronica clearly make more sense for many reasons. One such reason is the obvious. Resident Evil 5 still plays rather fine in today's standard, and most will argue that it at least looks and plays much better than the older Resident Evil games that haven't been recently remade yet. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, hugely important characters like Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker have not yet been properly established in the contemporary Resident Evil remakes, resulting in an RE5 remake that introduces plenty of characters and concepts that haven't been properly touched up on and established. Remaking these older games will fix that. Sure, it mixes up the order of the remakes, but at the end of the day, we're all smart enough to know which number comes before the other, and it's just more Resident Evil remakes for us to sink our teeth into, and if done well by Capcom, us fans will be pleased. The developers of Resident Evil 1 Remake claim that the remake was a product of the original vision the team had for the very first Resident Evil game, and that extra few years the remake had over the original to take advantage of the available technology resulted in a game that was decidedly definitive, but very much a product of its own time. The recent Resident Evil remakes all fit a very deliberate format. Third-person, over-the-shoulder gameplay, a refined system first introduced from the original Resident Evil 4, and we've seen how the gameplay has fared. Resident Evil 2 was given new life with its remake, and its mechanics and different perspective made the game feel that much more atmospheric, haunting, and visceral. And while Resident Evil 3 Remake was admittedly rushed out and failed to truly capitalize on what made the original Resident Evil 3 so great, the gunplay and perspective shifts aren't what was to blame for that blunder. Resident Evil 4 Remake, while a game that wasn't exactly necessary, is undoubtedly the most polished of the bunch. Resident Evil 1 is the only game from the original trilogy that hasn't seen any modern facelift, and while players can easily pick up the HD remaster of the remake on their preferred devices, it still feels like a piece is missing from the collection of remakes we currently have, and this is coming from a huge fan of Resident Evil 1 and its current remake. Switching the perspective over to an over-the-shoulder format with the current gunplay of Resident Evil will, in my opinion, do wonders for the game and open the floodgates to fans who have been wanting to visit or revisit the Spencer Mansion. The original Resident Evil 2 featured incredibly narrow pathways and corridors, just like the areas of RE1 did. But look at how well that conversion fared for Resident Evil 2 Remake from a gameplay perspective. The blueprint is right in front of Capcom. Simply remake the entirety of Resident Evil 1 Remake with all of its enhancements over the original game, and present it in the RE engine with the modern gameplay and mechanics of the recent RE games. Put in VR for icing on the cake, and perhaps make the game feature the canonical ending for the first time as the cherry on top. Resident Evil Remake as it stands is an incredible game, and one that those who played it regard it as one of the greatest remakes ever made. That said, this remake, a game that was a product of a team that wanted to truly deliver upon the original vision of the game, is more than ready and deserving to get a fresh coat of paint, a fresh perspective, and a fresh new set of players to experience one of the best settings and stories in this nearly 30-year-old franchise. Just because the foundation is solid doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be considered for a remake. Heck, Resident Evil 4 was already remade and is already a solid game to this day. A fresh and faithful remake, including both Chris and Jill's campaigns with revamped graphics, controls, a new perspective, new puzzle solutions, and the like, is more than enough to warrant a revisit to the haunting Spencer Mansion to reintroduce players to the most significant survival horror game ever created. As always, let me know what you think about another Resident Evil remake in the comments below. We all know that Code Veronica is the most desired to get a remake, but don't slouch on RE1 or Dino Crisis now. Watch this video to learn more about Capcom and their plans to release more remakes in the future, and stay tuned for more Resident Evil content to come. Thank you all for your continued support, and I will see you real soon in the next one.